Okay, so energy, key to life. Life and health are dependent upon adequate nutritional intake. That's absolutely right if we base all our biochemistry on nutrients and burning fuel. I think we've made a cardinal error over many, many years, and we've forgotten the most important nutrient, which is oxygen. Okay? Very little emphasis has been put on the real important nutrient, because you can only live for 4 minutes without oxygen. You can live for 4 weeks or more without food. Okay? You can live 7 days without water, but you can only live for 4 minutes without oxygen. That's on the assumption you don't get any come in. Okay? In other words, you've had a blow, you're unconscious, etc. But the majority of people do wander around with varying levels of hypoxia, or low levels. And when we've done the oximeter readings, we get people down to 90–91%, and we've had as high as 99. I've never met anybody who's had 100%. And Clive said, oh, that's because there isn't 100 on the oximeter. It's a two-scale digit, but that's not true. You can get 100. Because the best I've had was somebody who has recently passed on, in fact, who had chronic lung fibrosis disorder, and she showed to 100%. And I couldn't believe this, but she came in and she got an oxygen cylinder by the side of her chair, and she just had some puffs of it, and that was brilliant. You know, I couldn't believe, you know, how good the oxygen was. But it did show that you can get to 100%, but very few people do. So I think life and health depend upon adequate nutrients. Yes, we know that, to get all the necessary nutrition in, but also oxygen. And we'll come to realize that oxygen is probably the one thing that we've all missed, because it is responsible for practically every ailment, or lack of oxygen, every ailment that the human being suffers from. And it starts to go downhill more or less from the moment we're born. If we don't operate at 100%, then we're not, all our oxygenation pathways are not working. Even if we work at 98%, it sounds impressive, but it means you're 2% down. And 2% down, accumulated over 60 years, can create a lot of problems. You may not notice them for many, many years, but eventually you will. So we know that nutrients are made of proteins, or in the body, these are constructive amino acids which build tissue, transport molecules, form antibodies, form enzymes, build chemical messengers. Fatty acids, we're familiar with, or build all our cell membranes. They're sources of energy, stores of energy, protect the organs, and electrical insulators. And cholesterol goes on to build the steroid hormones. Carbohydrates, we know, are fuel, and they're linked with fatty acids to form glycolipids. Vitamins, some of them act as coenzymes for specific enzyme pathways. They act as antioxidants like vitamin E and vitamin C. They're involved with blood clotting like the bioflavonoids and vitamin K. And they form part of cell membranes like phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylinositol. We know, and this is really what I wanted to bring this in, is that 20 of the vitamins are called coenzymes when they're in their activated form. Okay? Now this is important to emphasize, because certain vitamins which act as coenzymes can only function in the human body when they're activated, or in a particular, have another attachment to it. It could be a hydrogen, it could be a phosphate group. These are called coenzymes. And a coenzyme acts as part of the equation. So it actually joins with the substrate with the enzyme, and the end product is part of the coenzyme. So it could be a hydrogen it donates, it could be a phosphate group, etc. And it's a vital part of the equation. Now, the good thing about these is they recycle. So what happens is, if you donate, let's say for instance, let's say for pyridoxal 5-phosphate goes through a pathway and the phosphate group disappears, the pyridoxal will be rephosphorylated again and just recycled. And you'll lose a little bit in your pee. Okay, each day, each time you have a pee, you'll lose micrograms of it. So the amount of pyridoxine, or the inert vitamin, that you need each day to prevent a deficiency disease is about 1.5, 1.6 milligrams per day. Okay, that's the standard of what the books will tell you. Now, if you have a genetic problem which doesn't allow you to activate pyridoxine into pyridoxal 5-phosphate in sufficient amounts, you may need to take pyridoxal 5-phosphate in much greater amounts because you're not recycling the old. Okay? So you may need 25 milligrams of P5P or pyridoxal 5-phosphate, 50 or 100, okay? Because you're simply not recycling the base amount. So the books are right. If you measure pyridoxine known as inert vitamin B6, you will only need 1.5, 1.6 per day. Okay? Now, if you can't activate it, you may need a vaster amount to make up that difference. So in other words, the body doesn't use 1.6 milligrams per day of B6, not for all the things B6 does in the body. It uses 1.6 because it loses that in the pee or the sweat every day. That's the difference, okay? So there's a very subtle difference. Now, that means that this is genetic problems. So whenever something comes up with a gene problem with a person, the likelihood is the person will need a coenzyme, because this is the genetic problem, is they're not able to activate the vitamin into the activated coenzyme form. So they may need to take a coenzyme, and they may need to take a substantial amount to build this back up. And then they can reduce it down until they find the optimal level. But they may find that after a while of leaving it off, it starts to show again because they obviously can't do this. Now, wouldn't it be nice to know if that was the case with you or me and so on? Because as you get older and you start to find bits fail, why do they start to fail? And that's an interesting question, because the systems aren't working, they're not repairing, because you're deficient in things and you're getting a build-up of toxins. So we need to try and find out what that is. And this is the beauty of what we've come to the conclusion, and the easy way to say this is to call it the genotype and the phenotype. So the genotype of a person is what you're born with. We'll come to this in a minute, is your constitution. Okay, you're born because of the genes that you've got from your mum and dad, and they got from their mum and dad, and so on all the way back. So you're a conglomeration of tossing coins, of 23,000 coins going up in the air. This one's mum, this one's dad, and so on, okay? Which straw that you get. And in the end, you come out tall, short, or medium in height, and with a predisposition towards, you know, running on your thyroid gland, running on your adrenals, or running on your gonads, and so on. So we've been able to get that down into 3 different types. But if you could find precisely what your genotype is, or more precisely than just that, you would be able to work out what it is your body needs to maintain it at an optimal level. Because you don't want to put up with your genotype. What you want to do is work with that and increase your health from what you're born with. Okay? And that is called epigenetics. So epigenetics is altering genes and modifying them from things which are above the genetic building blueprint. So I'm Christopher Astill Smith, that's what I was born as, baby Christopher Astill Smith, age 0, okay? But I was destined to be a green, okay? I was destined, therefore, to be deficient or need a greater concentration of certain nutrients, okay? And one of those for me is pyridoxal 5-phosphate. My father needed it, his father needed it, and so on. And if you go down the family tree, you can see different ailments that they suffered with are all related to pyridoxal 5-phosphate. So I've inherited that aspect from him. Now, if you could work out what it was aspect that you've inherited, you could do something about it and say, I need to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So when it comes to the genotype, the likelihood is it's going to be a coenzyme. Now, along with that, you may need, and we'll see a bit later, a little bit of extra magnesium or a little bit of extra zinc, okay, in certain genotypes. Now, that's what we're born with. Now, what Christopher Astill Smith is now is my phenotype. My phenotype is how those genes are expressing themselves right now. So I'm now the phenotype, okay, of what my genotype was, all right? Now, I can modify and improve my genotype, and I can make a bloody mess of my phenotype. You know, if I abuse myself, don't eat the right foods, and I live in a toxic environment, and so on and so on. So we have 2 aspects to us. We have to get the phenotype better, and the reason most of us have got bad phenotypes is not that we're hideously deficient, because most of us actually eat reasonably well, especially in this room, in comparison to most of the population. It's because we accumulate toxins. And all of us accumulate toxins which inhibit our pathways, so we need a greater amount of nutrients to improve our detoxification pathways to get rid of those toxic metals and those chemicals and radiations and things. Okay? So genotype, phenotype. So there's a very simple way of determining what your genotype and phenotype is, which I'm going to do in 2 ticks. So when we come to a genotype, you may say, what was it, Kristen? Genotype, always think coenzymes, because this is the gene expression that when you've got a genetic problem, polymorphism, you need a greater concentration of the coenzyme to get that equation, that biochemical pathway, up to fruition. So we know things like thiamine pyrophosphate, thiamine triphosphate. FMN, flavin mononucleotide, flavin adenine dinucleotide, those are the B2 coenzymes. Niacinamide adenine dinucleotide, these are the vitamin B3. CoA, which is vitamin B5, pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is B6, tetrahydrofolate, which is one of the folates, methionyl tetrahydrofolate, which is known as folinic acid, methylene tetrahydrofolate, very important one. We're going to introduce a pathway where we found this works today, methylene tetrahydrofolate, and methyl tetrahydrofolate. These are all part of the folic acid cascade. Then we've got tetrahydrobiopterin, which is an offshoot of folic acid, but works as an important hydroxylator. Again, we'll see that in the pathway today. Adenosyl methylcobalamin, which is the active coenzymes of B12. Biotin. And then we've got 4 vitamins which are not vitamin Bs. All of these are vitamin Bs. And you'll notice that all the vitamin Bs that have a number are coenzymes, in addition to folic acid, which should have a number, but for some reason in this country didn't. In America they call it B9, but over here we still call it folic acid. But the ones like inositol and choline don't have a number because they're not essential vitamins and they're not coenzymes. But non-vitamin Bs that are coenzymes is vitamin C, because this is a oxidation reduction. It absorbs electrons. Alpha lipoic acid, which is also an antioxidant, but a great chelator of toxic metals. S-adenosyl methionine, which is part of the methylation pathway, and coenzyme Q10, which is in the mitochondria, which we'll talk about later. So those are your coenzymes. So when a person shows us a phenotype, those are the things you may say, let's check them out for coenzymes, and it'll usually be one, occasionally more than one of those. So the last nutrient that we need are minerals, which we know are necessary to build bones, act as catalysts or cofactors with enzyme pathways, regulate the permeability of cell membranes, maintain water balance, influence the contractibility of muscles, in other words calcium, magnesium, and regulate the response of nerves to stimuli. So life depends upon the right ionic balance. Remember that all minerals, to get into the body to be absorbed, have to be in ionic solution. We do not absorb a lump of calcium. Okay, it has to be ionic calcium, in the same way that you don't absorb a toxic metal that way either. Okay? We were talking yesterday about aluminium. You do not absorb aluminium. Okay? You absorb aluminium in solution. So if you cover something with aluminium foil, it'll be fine. Okay? But if you cover your chicken in aluminium, and then you roast the chicken and the steam from the chicken hits the aluminium foil, and that vapor drops back down onto the chicken, that'll be full of aluminium. Okay, because aluminium in solution, you've only got to put a piece of aluminium foil in a glass of even cold water for 5 minutes and a red person will weaken to it. Okay? They won't weaken to the water first or the dry aluminium, but when it's in solution they do. So remember, all minerals are absorbed in their ionic form. Therefore, the only minerals that can get absorbed really in the body, or most efficiently, are the ones that are water soluble. Okay? If you put chalk into here, it'll form a sediment in the bottom, won't it? We all agree that. So calcium carbonate or chalk is not a very soluble form of calcium. So why bother to put it in a capsule and supplement people with osteoporosis with it? Doesn't make sense really, does it? Use an ionizable form, you know, a chloride, a sulfate, a lactate, or even a citrate is much more efficient than a carbonate. Okay? So this is the first thing we learned about minerals, is you must find the most water-soluble forms. And the water-soluble forms, which Our traditional are the ones in here of what is labelled. So when you label water and you look at that, they give you the calcium, magnesium levels of the minerals, which are known as the cations. But what about the anions? This is the bit where it gives the solubility. And you'll see they measure here the chlorides, the sulfates and the carbonates, all right, and the phosphates. Okay? Those are the ones that are soluble. Okay? So hence, the most soluble minerals are chlorides, sulfates and phosphates and carbonates. Okay? So therefore, when you come to prescribe a nutrient, you want the most soluble form, don't you? Most ionizable and the most soluble form. So we know ionic balance depends upon adequate nutritional intake from ionized minerals. So I want to talk about the types of minerals in relationship to the body types as we go through this, because different body shapes, different constitutionals, do respond very, very precisely to different mineral compounds. Okay, and this is very, really important, because if you've got a green person and you're trying to prescribe the wrong type of mineral, it won't show. But if you give them a chloride for a green person, it will show. Okay, so we may have missed, say for instance, zinc. A person could be chronically deficient in zinc, but if you only test them with zinc citrate or zinc sulfate, they may not show to it. Okay? So this is the value of finding out those body types through the colours right at the beginning. Okay, down to energy. 1,500 to 2,000 calories recommended for human adults, along with a combination of oxygen and food molecules. The latter is mostly carbohydrates and fats in order to produce energy. Food molecules are oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. So the byproducts of oxidation and the production of energy is very clean. It's carbon dioxide and water. And these are very important molecules. And some of the energy is used to convert ADP into ATP. So in other words, our final molecule of energy is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is a third phosphate group added to ADP. So all the rest of the chemical energy produced in the body goes to produce heat. Okay? So the amount of energy that we produce to do this, okay, and to fire our brain is very small. Okay? We think that's where all our energy goes. It's very small. The majority goes to produce heat. And why does it go to produce heat? Because it keeps us at a temperature way above what the air is. All right, so we're at 37 degrees, and some days it's been getting up to 26. Yeah. So even on a hot day here, we're still 11 degrees down, which takes a lot of heat to keep us at that temperature all the time. Okay. Now, if we drop down 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be 5 degrees centigrade, if we were to drop down that, it's estimated we would live to about 250 years of age. Not bad, because the whole oxidation process would slow down. But your whole life would be very slow. So 250 years would seem like 2,000 years, really. So, and conversely, if you speed it up, okay, you'll live a less time. Okay, and this was actually in the paper last week. Okay, that people with low body temperatures actually live longer, okay, because it's less oxidative reaction. That means although they're slower, they tend not to burn up oxygen, which means they don't create as many free radicals. And this is thought still to be the major cause of the aging process, is the production of free radicals. In other words, reactive oxygen species, which cause inflammation and damage and make our oils or our fatty membranes go rancid. And lo and behold, it's gradually becoming clearer now, the biggest cause of reactive oxygen species or free radical production in the human body is a lack of oxygen. Okay, it's actually hypoxia. A lack of oxygen stimulates the production of a nasty little substance called xanthine oxidase enzyme, which goes on to produce superoxide and nitric oxide. And when those two come together, they produce peroxynitrite, which I'll show you in a chart, which is the most inflammatory and damaging of all the free radicals. Okay? So hypoxia is a really, really important problem, not just for the fact you don't get oxygen around to the brain to get it to work or the heart, but it actually stimulates free radical production. In other words, inflammation. So at each stage of the metabolic pathway, some chemical energy is converted into heat. Only a tiny fraction of the original chemical energy is used actually for work. Now, this is adenosine triphosphate. I apologize, it's on a black background. This is made from adenine, the nucleotide base, ribose, which is the 5 sugar here, 5 carbon molecule sugar, with a phosphate group. And you'll note with the phosphate group, you've got 1 phosphate, 2 phosphate, 3 phosphate. Hence the reason it's called triphosphate, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. But there's a difference. These last 2 phosphates are attached by magnesium. So this is actually called magnesium ATP. And this is what you produce in your mitochondria. Okay, so when we talk about energy and ATP, the actual technical word is magnesium ATP, because not all ATP has that magnesium. So we use for our tests, and what are in all the kits that you should use is magnesium ATP and not just ATP. Okay? So magnesium ATP, so it has that magnesium bond. That makes magnesium very, very important element in the production of energy and the actual final part of adding that last phosphate group in the mitochondria to make the ATP itself, even though the ATP may only last for a fraction of a second before it's used. But magnesium is a really key element, and we know that magnesium shows up with people with energy problems more than anything else. If you want the quick cut to energy production, you've got somebody going out there to do an event, and you're not sure, you haven't got time to test them out on the track and come back and see what they need. The sure way to help them is to give them on a B complex, because virtually all the vitamin Bs are necessary in the production of energy, and a large slug of magnesium. Okay, you can't go too far wrong with those two. Okay? So you needn't actually worry about measuring too much, but if you put them on a B complex, but you may need to say, well, actually this person needs, with their genetic type and constitution, they may need pyridoxal 5-phosphate as opposed to pyridoxine. But basically, if you think Bs and think magnesium. Now, when it comes to magnesium, think what type of magnesium is it for their body type? Okay? Are you going to fill them up with magnesium citrate and it doesn't actually muscle test for them? The answer is no. No point filling them up with magnesium citrate if they're not that body type. So let's make sure we understand this, and then we'll come back to it again. Green body types need chlorides. Okay, they respond to chlorides. Chlorides are great because they're the most water soluble of all minerals. Blue body types need sulfates. They love sulfur for detoxifying. Everything about a blue person, blue people are the shorter people, they need sulfur and sulfates. Red people need phosphates, except with zinc, where zinc phosphate is totally insoluble. We use zinc picolinate. So red people need zinc picolinate. If you have a zinc compound, a zinc mix, a zinc single, think picolinate for that. But for everything else, it's phosphates with the red. Okay? So reds are the ones who really, they're thinner. There's not an ounce of fat on a true red, really, hardly. They make the long distance runner. Okay? You look at the marathon runners, they're the thin ones, aren't they? Okay. The sprinter is the big guy, you know, is the muscle. That's the green. The green is the sprinter. That's aerobic, real power there for 10 seconds, and then that's it. They've had it. Okay, so they've got the real power, big boys. Okay, well, the blues, good for dancing, good for ice skating. I discovered. I had a little girl during the week, and I said to her mother, I said, "What colour do you think she's going to be?" And the mother said, "I've watched your videos, Chris." She said, "She's a blue." And I said, well, you know, she's only 13 or something. And I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I'm a blue." And she said, "I'm 5'1". My husband's very small, and grandparents are small. She said, "You know, the girl is bound to be small." So she was a blue, in fact. And she whispered to me, she said, "Does that mean I don't have to do sport?" I said, "Yeah, you're right." Because you don't get a blue as a high jumper, do you? Or a long jumper, or a sprinter. You may be longer distance, but you know, blues are not really the best for sports, or for that type of track events and things. So, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate, when the last phosphate is used and the energy is dissipated, again we've got that magnesium bridge here, magnesium ADP, linking the first and the second instead of the second and the third there. So adenosine diphosphate is like a discharging battery, and adenosine triphosphate is like a charged one. So there's still some charge in ADP, because ADP itself can still produce energy, but not as fully charged as the fully charged battery here. So think of it as a battery which charges, discharges, charges, discharges, and this occurs many, many times a second. This is not a slow build-up of energy which is then used when you want to, run or anything. Its energy is being produced all the time. Every tissue in the body produces energy, and every tissue in the body, except certain ones like the red blood cells, have mitochondria or powerhouses where this occurs. Most cells have at least one powerhouse in there, but muscles have many powerhouses in there in a cell because they do more work, and what has the most is the neuron. The nerve has more than even the muscle because it has to produce more energy to not fire the electricity so much, but to pump out the calcium and the sodium which is imbibed in when the nerve depolarizes. So in other words, the active pumps, the sodium pump and the calcium pump, to pump the calcium and sodium out when the nerve depolarizes, takes energy. And that's why a nerve uses more energy. Therefore, when a person is tired and lacking energy, the first place you see it is in the nervous system, followed by the muscles. So the patient may get dizzy, they may get visual symptoms, they may get brain fog, they may get balance problems. Right? These are all places where we produce most energy. And then they'll get fatigue in their muscles. And then eventually the fatigue will lead to a build-up of lactic acid, and then they'll get pain. So these are sort of things, a cascade of events that can occur. Now, everybody did biochemistry at college, or everybody who's done biochemistry at college knows that the dreaded Krebs cycle is going to come up sooner or later. The production of energy, and it means absolutely nothing at college except the fact you've got to take it, you've got to pass your biochemistry exam, and then forget it all, okay? And then 20 years later you come on a course and you think, oh, this is really quite interesting. I wish I'd understood it better then, but of course when you understood it then, it didn't have any meaning. All these circles and oxidative reductions, elements and things, they don't really have any meaning unless you could actually apply it. And lacking in energy in one form or another, whether that's fatigue, brain fog, neurological problems, etc., is the biggest cause of human ailments. So it is rather important. Energy is the key thing. We are, at the end of the day, only energy. So I learned this from a chiropractor in the States at a conference called David Seaman. And he put it in a way that I've taught ever since, that the production of energy is as easy as A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. Okay? So if you can understand this, that's all you need to understand, really. Okay? So I don't want to go into the details of each oxidation pathway. I want you to understand production of energy is in 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. Right? That's it, really. Number 1 is called glycolysis. This occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, not in the mitochondria. Number 2 is called the citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle. Okay, this occurs in the mitochondria, the powerhouse. So we've got to get our fuel across the mitochondrial membrane for this to occur. Number 3 is the electron transport, or otherwise known as oxidative phosphorylation. Number 3. So we've got glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport. Those are the 3 bits you just got to remember. The major fuel that we burn is glucose. Now, we can burn other fuels, fatty acids and amino acids, at certain points in the whole energy pathway, but the fuel that goes in through the cell membrane is usually glucose, and crosses over the cell membrane outside and then passes to the mitochondrial membrane, and this glycolysis is anaerobic. There's no oxygen involved in this pathway at all. And the end product of this glycolysis is called pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Okay, now, as we'll come to see a little later on, pyruvate then crosses the mitochondrial membrane and produces acetyl-CoA, which is the substrate or the starting substance for the Krebs cycle. If we fail to convert pyruvate into acetyl-CoA across the mitochondrial membrane, we get a buildup of pyruvate. Okay? So on muscle testing, if the first pathway has a blockage at the end there, you'd expect pyruvate to weaken, okay, because you've got a relative excess of pyruvate. And acetyl-CoA would strengthen the person because they got a deficiency of this. Same rule for everything in functional biochemistry. The substrate will weaken because you've got a relative build-up of it. The end product of what the patient needs will strengthen a weak muscle because the body is saying, I want that. Okay? So it's the golden rule. So if you want something, you need something, remember, energy or substances can't be destroyed. There must be a build-up of something else. So if you want something, then you're deficient in it because there's an excess not being able to produce it somewhere along the chain. So if pyruvate weakens, it tends to be shunted off or oxidized into lactic acid. So this is rather important with our sports people because lactic acid will create pain if it's not metabolized and recycled and gives you a lot of pain in the muscles and the nerves. So when you get build-up of lactic acid in the nerve tissue, you get pain. It is a sensitizer of what are called the nociceptors, those nerves that transmit about pain. If you get a build-up of lactic acid in the muscle, it gives fatigue. In other words, the person really can't run anymore. This is what happens when the athlete, the long distance, hits the wall. Okay? They got 19 miles into the marathon and they can't move another foot forward. Okay, it just won't go. That's fatigue, that's hitting the wall. And that is usually a build-up of lactic acid. You stay still for a little bit, you try and recover, and then eventually you can start to put one foot in front of another, and eventually they can actually trot a little bit and get going again. Okay, but they've hit that wall where they've run out of fuel. That's the build-up of lactic acid. So lactic acid is a sensitizer of the nociceptor. In other words, you feel pain and fatigue. This type of patient who has high levels of lactic acid and not exercising will be very sensitive to touch. You know, you'll say, oh, hi, nice to see you, David. And you say, oh, are you tender? Oh, yes, everything is tender, particularly the areas, obviously, where they come complain of. But you just touch them or prod in gently, and it will be tender. Okay, that's lactic acid buildup. Okay? You must have come across patients like this, people who have pains all over. Everything you touch is, oh, ow, oh. And you think, you're putting it on, calm down, and they're not. They are actually very sensitive, very tender. It's because they've got a build-up of lactic acid, and that's simply a lack of the nutrients to convert pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, and the major nutrient there which does this is vitamin B1 or thiamine. It's one of the typical symptoms of thiamine or B1 deficiency is a build-up of lactic acid. Now, acetyl-CoA spins the Krebs cycle here, and the Krebs cycle is purely a process of producing hydrogen atoms, H pluses or protons, and to do this we oxidize NAD or the activated coenzyme of vitamin B3 and FAD from B2. So to spin the Krebs cycle we really need B3 and B2, and what that does is it produces H pluses which then enter into the membrane between the outer and the inner mitochondrial membrane, and they accumulate in this intermembrane space, build up of protons and form what's called a proton pump. Now at the end of the day, every molecule of glucose, every molecule, produces 38 molecules of ATP. So this is really a very efficient machine, and most of this is produced in the mitochondria. If we didn't have a mitochondria and we were anaerobic, we would produce relatively small amounts of energy. So in glycolysis we only produce 8 molecules of ATP, 2 in the Krebs cycle, but 28 molecules in the electron transport in the membrane, in the intermembrane, the space between the inner and the outer membrane of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria itself is really the big powerhouse. Now, if we don't use glucose, we can use alternative forms, and we tend to use these when we run out of glucose. So when we get to a certain point in our energy production, okay, and our blood glucose levels drop, we then have to start converting to other forms of energy. Now, when we go off and run aerobically, okay, so you got out of bed and you decided you're going to go for a run in the morning, okay, and you have 4 minutes of running at your maximum aerobic pace, and you've run out of glucose. Your blood sugar level has dropped, or blood glucose levels dropped. Okay, 4 minutes roughly. At which time you then have to convert to stored glucose or glycogen. So glycogen is a stored starch, basically. It's how we store. And glycogen is stored in the liver and in the muscle tissues. So what you do is you then, through gluconeogenesis, is you break down your glycogen into glucose. And so you've got another source of fuel. So when you run in the morning at your maximum aerobic pulse, what you'll find there, you'll hit a point where you suddenly change, like changing gear. You'll say, oh, I've changed into a different source of energy. An alternative source of energy kicks in. So you may have a moment when you don't feel quite as efficient, when your blood picks this up, when your muscles pick it up and say, mobilize, start mobilizing glycogen. And the one key nutrient for mobilizing glycogen is pyridoxal 5-phosphate. Okay, you do need magnesium and you need calcium in there as well, but it's mostly P5P that you need, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. And then you run for 18 minutes on your liver glycogen, and then for up to 60 minutes on, this is all in the notes, so don't worry about writing it down. You run for up to 60 minutes on your muscle glycogen, at which time you're then knackered. Okay, you've got nothing left at all. You've only got one real source now of energy that you chuck, and that's fat. And the bad news is you don't start burning fat until you've been exercising for about an hour. Okay, then you start mobilizing the fat through a process called beta oxidation, which burns the fat and converts it into acetyl-CoA, ready to pop into the furnace, into the Krebs cycle. So fatty acids are burnt at this source here. You can also burn amino acids. Now, you don't want to burn amino acids, really, as a source of energy. Okay? Why? Because where do you get the amino acids from? The richest source of amino acids is your muscle tissue. So if you start burning your muscle tissue up, you're burning the very structures which create it. And this is really bad for athletes and sports people who go for the burn. You know, they run for an hour, I'm going to do another 10 minutes. Where's the source of energy coming from? Okay? If they've got the fat, that's fine, they burn up fatty acids. But some people don't. They don't burn fat for a particular reason, all right? There's something locking that fat in, which we'll talk about later. So if you can't burn fat, you'll burn protein. And protein will mobilize, okay, you mobilize your protein into the amino acids, which you can then chuck into the furnace. It's expensive fuel to do this, okay? But you can do it. Now, there's only one substance which will make you do that, which has to be stimulated to convert protein into amino acids, and that's cortisol. Okay? So this is why people, when they got low cortisol, burned out adrenals, they have difficulty with gluconeogenesis of building their blood sugar level up. But it's mostly they start to burn their fuel, their muscle tissue, to convert it into amino acids. All right? So there are times when cortisol is naturally high. Now, the time is first thing in the morning when it's high. And for people when they exercise, it's slightly different. It's between 7 and 9 in the morning, if you exercise, which would be when most people go for a run in the morning, it's high. And between 7 and 9 in the evening, okay, when most people would come out of the office and maybe go and think, I'll have a game of football or squash or whatever it might be. Those are naturally levels of cortisol. Now, the body has high levels with circadian rhythms and things, between about 4 to 6 in the morning, about 5 o'clock on average in the morning, we're high because we don't want to wake up with low blood sugar, okay? Otherwise we're in foul mood, Right? And we also get a slight elevation between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. If you don't have that elevation, you feel low. You know, and a lot of people here possibly feel low later on in the afternoon. You know, they get that 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock when they have to have a piece of chocolate or something. Yes, no, not for us. We're not like that. But if you do have one of those people who you get that that hypoglycemic reaction, is because they've got to have a fix fast because they're not producing the cortisol in sufficient amounts. But if you're exercising in those times, they've found you will strip your muscle tissue because your cortisol level is high. Therefore, you'll burn muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue is rich in what are called branched chain amino acids, which is valine, leucine, isoleucine. So it's very wise for people who really take up a lot of sport and exercise, particularly in those periods, that they take branched chain amino acids, because that will act as the fuel instead of their muscles. Right? So this is why they take branched chain amino acids as a powder or as a capsule. It's pretty disgusting stuff as a powder. You know, I've tried it. It's not water soluble. It's much easier to swallow it as a capsule than the powder. If you put it in a powder, you have to put it in a shake, which means they probably put it in with milk, whey, or whatever. And we found those are about the worst things, whey proteins for people, particularly blue people, you know, because they don't get on very well with milk at the best of times. And worst of all, and this is absolutely fantastic, this, you know, you see all these people going into weightlifting shops, and half the health food stores now are converted over to weightlifting or power building, haven't they? And you know the real thing in there, what they're full of, is whey protein, isn't it? Every other, this size, you can come out with bags of this stuff. And of course, if you've got parasites, it is unbelievable the fuel that you'll give the parasites, okay? And their health goes down that up. And you look at a lot of these lads who are going in there, they're all covered in spots in the skin. Look at their skin. If you want to see them, where the person's got a parasite, look at their skin. Okay, have they got big red rosacea signs? Are they coming out with spots, with pustules and things? Whey protein is about the worst thing you can possibly use. Okay, go to a vegetarian source, a nice balanced one like a hemp or a pea protein. Those are generally very good. Even in some cases, like a blue person, I would recommend organic soy. Is better than milk. Milk protein, almost impossible to get organic. They say, oh, this is very, very pure, this is grass-fed, etc., etc., etc. They tell you all sorts of good stuff. If you've got parasites, and most people in this room have got parasites, okay, it's just a matter of whether they're expressing themselves at the moment. You know, you wake them up with some raw protein, with some milk protein, and you'll soon know if you've got parasites or not. But most people are carrying eggs, and it's just a matter of time. As long as you can keep them flowing through, keep the eggs moving, you may never know that you've got parasites. But it's at the back of every single chronic health condition. When you've got somebody who's in pain, okay, they got pain continuously, inflammation in other words, never goes away, okay? Gets worse sometimes, better sometimes. Sometimes it's better at certain times of the day, sometimes it's worse with eating certain foods, so you can't work it out. Don't worry about where it is. It can be remote, it could be in the heel, the big toe, anywhere. The chances are it's a parasite. Okay, never forget that. Okay, and especially when you come to do the meridians, if the large intestine or the small intestine shows up, always think parasites. They're lurking there, and all you've got to do is feed them. Okay, so oxidized fatty acids can be oxidized into there, and also we can use amino acids, which we talked about, and they pop into the Krebs cycle, so they go straight into the furnace, especially the branched chain amino acids of leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Now these need a special coenzyme to get them to burn, as do the fatty acids. So fatty acids, particularly the odd-numbered fatty acids, the propionic, etc., the odd numbers, and the branched chain amino acids, need adenylyl cobalamin to be able to get them into the Krebs cycle to get them to work. So this is where B12 fits in, adenylyl cobalamin, as the coenzyme. Now a lot of people are deficient, or relatively deficient, in adenylyl cobalamin. Not that they're deficient in B12, they just simply can't get them to work. Rather like we talked about pyridoxal 5-phosphate as opposed to pyridoxine. Now you can verify this by muscle testing, is if a person strengthens to adenylyl cobalamin, what I do is I test them with hydroxycobalamin, the inert form of B12. And most of the time they don't strengthen to hydroxycobalamin. But they do strengthen to adenosine, which means they can't activate it. All right? If they strengthen to hydroxycobalamin, you know they're deficient in B12. And what you'll find is that most people are actually not that deficient. Okay? Some people are deficient because of their diet or malabsorption, but the majority of people, when they show to one of these coenzymes, is because they can't activate it, which is a genetic disorder. Okay, so you have to give the activated form. Now, there are some people who are deficient in B6 and B12, etc., because of their diet. And we need to help them find the right foods which are rich in that, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So our major nutrients in glycolysis is magnesium, a little bit of zinc. Well, you know, that zinc works in one of the equations here. Potassium and vitamin B3. That's glycolysis. That gets us to the pyruvate. To cross pyruvate across the membrane, the mitochondrial membranes to acetyl-CoA, we need B1, B2, B3, alpha-lipoic acid, and more magnesium. To spin the Krebs cycle, we need B1, B2, B3, B5, alpha-lipoic, more magnesium, and manganese. In the mitochondrial membrane, for oxidative electron transport, we need CoQ10, which again we'll talk about later, iron, sulfur, and phosphorus to add that last phosphate. But the most important nutrient here in the mitochondria is O2. So we really need to know how do we get the O2 into the mitochondria. So this is why, as I said, if you want the quick cut and you don't have time to test the patient, or you want to just give advice, is B complex, you know, with all the Bs, because they're all shown there, and magnesium. So there's about 9 different pathways between glucose, oxidative pathways between glucose and pyruvate, and every one of those needs magnesium. And every one of those needs the type of magnesium for you. Remember, chlorides for greens, phosphates for reds, and sulfates for blues. So here's the pathway. This is the chart. You've actually got a copy of this. The A3 copy is probably just about readable, isn't it? If it's not readable, then you will come to the problem that we're going to discuss this afternoon, of not enough oxygen in your eyes. So your eyes are failing. But you should be able to just about read that. We do it as a laminate. Have you got the laminate to show them that? We've got a lovely laminate which we've done specially for you, which combines both the oxygenation hemoglobin and the energy pathway. Turn it around, Bob. That's it. Good. So it's a nice one. I've done back to back for you. These have the advantage that you can wash them, you can pin them to the walls. These are a bit small. They're not that impressive. They might be impressive to you, but they're not impressive to patients. Patients like the big chart. And also you can put your coffee on those. And if you spill your coffee, you don't stain them because they're laminated. Okay, so here's the energy pathway, glycolysis, citric acid or Krebs cycle here, and then the electron transport between the inner and the outer membrane. Very complex, but on the other hand, I'm going to make it really very easy for you as we go along. So we pop protons in there and we jump electrons between one complex and the next, till we get to this complex 4 where we put molecular oxygen. And this is the only place where oxygen occurs in the whole of the production of energy, is here. So we've got to get it from here in the room, down the lungs, round the circulation to the tissues which require the oxygen. We've got to get it across the membrane of the cell, across the mitochondrial membranes, to inside here in the mitochondria, and we've then got to pump it in there to be oxidized here in this last part of the electron transport. Okay? So it's really interesting because each of these membranes, as we'll see, are made of oils or phospholipids, and each one is a little different. Okay? Some are richer in one type of phospholipid and some are richer in other ones. And understanding a little bit about which ones might be at fault, and therefore which oils to prescribe for a person, is very important.